Have you ever wanted to get into the genre of fantasy but struggled to find a satisfying entry point? Or have you tried watching anime and couldn't quite understand all the hype? Either way, I might have a solution. The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson and One Piece by Eiichiro Oda may seem largely unrelated, but I actually think they share a lot in common. In my opinion, they stand together as some of the best that fantasy has to offer. I'm only 2 books out of 5 done in the Stormlight Archive, which is about 2,200 pages, but I've come to notice and appreciate a lot of qualities that I've also observed in One Piece. They share similar structures, thematic elements, and climactic writing. I feel like most people who enjoy one would thoroughly enjoy the other. This video is essentially going to be a pitch for both One Piece and the Stormlight Archive, while also discussing how they overlap. It's going to be relatively spoiler-free, so if you're interested in either one, or if you've already experienced them, then this video is for you. The most obvious similarity between One Piece and the Stormlight Archive is how ridiculously long these stories are. One Piece is currently at 1,145 chapters, whereas Stormlight has 5 books finished out of 10, each of which is 1,000 pages or more. In terms of the sheer amount of story, the Stormlight Archive is arguably longer than One Piece, but neither of these stories are long for no reason. Their intimidating scales are entirely by design. This is because One Piece and Stormlight fall within the subgenre of fantasy known as epic fantasy.
Now, this is epic.
An epic fantasy is defined by a broad scope and subject matter. These stories usually span significant periods of time and focus on a wide range of characters, themes, and concepts. They're set in bizarre and unusual worlds with an incredible amount of detail. Epic fantasies are typically packed with lore. Their plots include all corners of the world that they inhabit, and they take a gradual approach to building the stakes. Some examples of epic fantasy stories are Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, and Malazan. Game of Thrones is also technically an epic fantasy, but it's a little bit more grounded than they typically are. One Piece is definitely a battle shonen and heavily utilizes tropes and formulas from that style of storytelling. But from a broader narrative perspective, it is an epic fantasy to its core. If you're a fan of One Piece and you've never read or watched an epic fantasy, then you should go do so. Regardless of whether or not it's Stormlight Archive, you'll probably really enjoy it because One Piece was heavily inspired by that genre. And if you're a Stormlight fan and you primarily stick to traditional fantasy novels, then you will likely enjoy One Piece for the same reason. Both of these series have a large roster of characters, so much so that you'll probably forget many of their names over and over again. They have arcs that span hundreds of chapters and thousands of pages with significant depth. They feature meticulous world building where every location, creature, and scientific or magical element ties together in some way. The main characters are followed across their entire journeys and you get a look at their entire lives. You'll see them at their highest and at their lowest. You'll watch them go from average people to notorious legends. You'll see countless side characters given the same amount of care and attention. Sometimes those minor characters will return in unexpected yet satisfying ways. All of these characters inhabit a world that is constantly in motion, rapidly moving towards a point of great change. Now, you can find all of this stuff in most epic fantasy stories, but there is something about the way that Brandon Sanderson approaches the Stormlight Archive that is very similar to how Oda executes the story of One Piece. It's kind of hard to put into words without spoiling, but all of the stuff that you might enjoy about One Piece's world building and grand scale, you will find in the Stormlight Archive. This next comparison is a little more specific. The primary storylines of One Piece and the Stormlight Archive are pretty distinct. One Piece is an adventure about defining and attaining freedom in an oppressive world. The Stormlight Archive is about the preparation for an apocalyptic war in a world ravaged by devastating magical hurricanes. However, they do share some common themes. The most prominent, in my opinion, is that of unreliable history and the recontextualization of perspectives. How does information get distorted over time? How much of history can we really accept as undeniably true? How do particular worldviews develop and what are the individual nuances within them? All of these questions are central to One Piece as well as the Stormlight Archive. In the Stormlight Archive, the continent of Roshar has a clearly defined history with multiple factions and infamous events. As the story unfolds, you slowly discover that things are not exactly as they seem. There are gaps, inconsistencies, and esoteric mysteries, all of which are crucial to the plot. One Piece is the same. Without spoiling too much, the world starts out very simple, but as the characters travel farther and farther, you become introduced to more complex political systems. There is a vast and ancient history with a century's worth of information completely erased from present-day libraries. We're constantly learning about big figures and incidents with reputations given to them through biased perspectives. While both stories are challenging the absolute nature of truth and the many types of misinformation, they simultaneously explore various mindsets and worldviews. They delve into moral philosophy, spirituality, and religion. They highlight different social classes, governments, and civilizations, and this is explored through individuals and groups. In many ways, these stories are a reflection of our world, pulling from countless cultures and societies. Finally, there's one more major similarity between these two stories that I want to discuss. That is the insane levels of climactic intensity. Both Sanderson and Oda are well known for hitting some of the highest emotional and narrative peaks imaginable. When it comes to Brandon Sanderson, there's a term coined by his fans for this specific style of writing called the Sanderlanche. Essentially, in almost every book, there are these points in the story where the plot goes from 0 to 100 in a matter of pages. You'll be reading and suddenly all of the seemingly insignificant plot points will come together for one massive crescendo. You'll feel a rush of emotions like never before. You'll be cheering with tears in your eyes as everything builds into a beautiful medley of action and overwhelming hype. As for One Piece, Oda's approach is a bit different. However, you will constantly be blindsided with a very similar rush of emotions. If there's one thing he knows how to write nearly every time without fail, it's an unbelievably cathartic climax. Everything that gets introduced is important, and he'll make sure that you remember that by the end of every arc. One Piece will give you whiplash with how it makes you weep 1 second and jump with excitement the next. You will be left with your jaw on the floor as multiple story beats culminate in a single magnificent brushstroke. Obviously, I can't say much more without spoiling, but just know that the third act is almost always going to hit for both Stormlight and One Piece. Now, of course, these series aren't exactly the same. They may even be more different than they are alike. One Piece is much goofier and absurdist, almost reminiscent of old school cartoons. Stormlight tends to maintain a more serious tone, and it's a little more grounded overall. One Piece focuses on pirates and a shonen-style power system. Stormlight is closer to traditional fantasy with a slightly more complex, magic-based system. Ultimately, these are two unique stories with their own identities. However, when it comes to the core of what makes them special, I personally believe that they can appeal to fans on either side. Both of them are grand fantasy epics with a huge emphasis on world building. Both of them touch upon related themes, while also exploring society and humanity as a whole. Both are capable of hitting breathtaking narrative peaks. One Piece deserves to be viewed alongside fantasy novels like the Stormlight Archive because frankly, it has a little more in common with them than your average battle shonen, although it takes a ton of inspiration from stuff like Dragon Ball Z too. But if you're not usually one to enjoy anime, then you may be surprised with how much One Piece has to offer. In the same way, if you've never been particularly fond of fantasy but are a fan of One Piece, then the Stormlight Archive could be a solid gateway into a brand new realm of storytelling. Basically, if you've experienced one, then I highly recommend you check out the other. The only thing standing in your way is the intimidating length, but at this point, that shouldn't faze you too much. And if you're watching this without having read either one, then my advice to you is to just take it slow and enjoy the ride. If you're still here, be sure to let me know what you thought of this video in the comments. Are there any comparisons that I overlooked? Are there any other distinctions I should have made? I'm always happy to continue this discussion down below. Also, I recently made a Discord server, so if you want to connect with the growing community here on the channel, then check the link in the description. Don't forget to drop a like if you enjoyed the vibes, and subscribe if you want to see more content in the future. That's all for now though. Hopefully I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.